It is 1 o'clock. I'm going to give it one more minute. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today for discussion on the topic of domestic violence during a pandemic. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, so the Phoenix Women Rising Employee Resource Group has brought to you several guest speakers who navigate the issue of domestic violence daily and help those affected in various ways. Our guest speakers are Barbara Schifano, who is a Learning and Development Director for the University of Phoenix and a member of the Board of Directors for the Arizona Foundation for Women. And we also have Doreen Nicholas, is the Survivor Engagement and Systems Change Specialist at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. Also, we have Catherine Ferguson Gilbert and Jenna Durango, who are both deputy county attorneys for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, and they both are within the Family Violence Bureau. Please join me in virtually welcoming Barbara Schifano, who will share a bit about the Arizona Foundation for Women.
Christy, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. We are delighted to partner with the Women's Rising Group on behalf of Arizona Foundation for Women to present today, a conversation that it's important to have and some information that I think you're going to find to be pretty startling. But before we talk about that, I just want to give you some information about Arizona Foundation for Women. We've had a long standing relationship with, let me just make sure we got this in the right order. There we go. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Yep, perfect. So we've had a long-standing relationship with University of Phoenix and have traditionally come, once a year to provide information on those issues that are affecting women in the workplace and women around the state of Arizona. So today is no different. Really quickly, if you're not familiar with the Arizona Foundation for Women, we are celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. This foundation was created through the bravery and the tenacity of women here in Arizona who were pretty disappointed as they learned there wasn't a lot of government funding that was available to women to address some of women's issues. So the foundation was created with 3 pillars that are focused on improving the safety, the health, and the economic empowerment for women. It's an easy mission to say, but it's certainly very difficult to achieve. The way that we do that is through what we call WRAP, and we WRAP to SHE. WRAP is the research that we do on the status of women across the state of Arizona. The advocacy that we do, similar to today, where we're bringing speakers to forums where women and men across the state can learn about the status of women and where we can help. And then our philanthropy, we're a granting organization, so we raise money that we grant to nonprofit organizations across the state that are rolling up their sleeves and just doing really amazing work to help women and families. We know based on research that when women are successful, their families are healthier, and as a community, our communities thrive. So it's an important mission and one that we're really proud of. Really quickly wanted to announce that we recently launched a new women's leadership program called She Leads. She Leads is now accepting applications. You might have seen some buzz on social media. But if you're not familiar with it or you haven't heard about it, the program starts in January, and it has 3 pillars to it. We want to develop women personally, professionally, and philanthropically. So to do that, there's a fundraising arm of this program, and where we provide tools and resources to women to help us fundraise, where 80% of the money that we raise then goes back to local nonprofits here in Arizona that assist women. There's a structured leadership curriculum that's a part of this program as well. And then every woman that is a participant in the program is paired up with a mentor that's there to provide encouragement, to provide coaching, and to share their wisdom, to walk alongside them as they're going through the program. So if you haven't heard about it, certainly get in contact with me, but scholarships are available. So the University of Phoenix has very generously offered a grant to the She Leads program to sponsor a handful of women through the program. So if you're interested in the program, check it out. I've got the links to our website here with my contact information. But we'll need you to submit a program application and an application fee by November 6th. We'll be looking at the applications to determine fit for the program and passion to develop leadership skills. And then we'll be announcing those women who are awarded a scholarship in early December. So again, if you have any questions about our brand new She Leads program, please get in contact with me. I strongly encourage the women here of University of Phoenix to take a look at the program and consider if it would be a good fit to help you build confidence and to help you build the knowledge and the skills to be better leaders in your personal life and in your professional life as well. So Christy, that was it for me. I'm going to pass it back over to you so we can get to today's program.
Perfect, thank you. So we now have Doreen Nicholas. She is with, again, the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. And Doreen, if you have a presentation and would like to start sharing, you are welcome to do so.
Okay, I am trying to get to the full screen. Hold, please.
There you are.
There I am now. I'm trying to get rid of the participant list, and when I do, I get this small little screen. So,
Do you see share screen? I believe it's at the top, or maybe it'll be at the bottom. Mine's at the bottom.
I can't get out of the participant list. There, close. Oh, I'm almost there. Oh, okay, here I am.
We're all
Don't
patient.
you love technology, Doreen?
Oh, I just love it. I should be an expert on Zoom by now. I'm just about zoomed out. Okay.
I hear you, me too. Hey, we can see your screen, it looks great.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so I'm going to try to compress what's been happening the last 6 months in Arizona, 7 months in Arizona, in 15 slides here. So about mid-March, when everything shut down, I was going to introduce myself a little bit. Okay, so I started doing this work 30 years ago at Sojourner Center, answering the phones, and then as an advocate in the shelter and group facilitator, case manager for transitional housing, and then came to the coalition in 1997 as staff number 5 and as the first trainer. So that was after the Violence Against Women Act money started rolling down hills, and programs and coalitions across the country were able to expand. So we actually had a trainer. Today we're a staff of about 20. And we have our helpline, which answers calls mostly from victims and survivors, but other times concerned family members, employers, Department of Child Safety caseworkers, etc. And we try to help people navigate the systems, find the resources they need, and safety plan. We do training and technical assistance. We have a sexual violence response department, a domestic violence response department, and then our communications and outreach keeps up with all of our social media, our fundraisers, and those kind of things. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we do. So normally every quarter we have a community partners addressing sexual violence meeting and a community partners addressing domestic violence meeting. But when the pandemic started, we figured that we needed to keep our ear to the ground and see what's happening around the state and how we could support the advocates and programs, because nobody knew how this would impact service delivery and survivors' experiences. So we started a weekly peer support Zoom meeting with all the programs around the state. And this is what we heard from them. So this is in that first month, mid-March to mid-April, that especially those first 2 weeks, nobody was calling, nobody was getting phone calls. They dropped off significantly. So a lot of the advocates were panicked, because the concern we had was, we know that isolation is a real control tactic for survivors. But we were thinking, what about those survivors in abusive relationships that now, because nobody can work or go out much, they're isolated that much more with their abuser? And then how do we do outreach? How do we let people know that we're still open for business and still providing services? How can we help people in this situation? So the first couple weeks or month, we started to brainstorm. At the same time, we were working with the Continuum of Care Housing Consortium in Arizona to survey the programs and what kind of personal protective equipment they needed, what kind of cleaning supplies they needed. So our hair was on fire around here. We were really trying to meet the needs and be flexible and adjust to what the emerging need was. So we drew on what we knew about abuse tactics and what survivors were telling us once the phone calls started to pick up. And what we were hearing was a lot more isolation. Those folks that would habitually be going to school or going to work where they might get some relief and be able to make those phone calls couldn't. And when the phone calls started picking back up on the helpline, for instance, we were getting these really short whispered calls, like somebody might have been able to get into the bathroom and make a phone call, or in the backyard and make a quick phone call. 20-second whispered calls like, I need a number 4. We'd give them the number and then they'd immediately hang up. So what we found was that those tactics of isolation, the financial abuse and control, those were that much more prominent in the cases that have been happening the past 7 months. So we brainstormed with the advocates and programs around the state and asked them to think about what their community was like, how it's set up. What is still open in your communities? Where are people still able to go or are still going to? And we came up with a list like grocery stores and gas stations, veterinarians' offices, pharmacies, post offices, banks, food banks, water stations. Like in our native communities, water stations were a place that everybody went to get water, laundromats, other community service kind of agencies, community information boards that might be in public parks, apartment, clubhouses, other essential services, and that varied from community to community. Certainly doctors' offices and community healthcare centers were places. And then we brainstormed about how we could get that information out there in a creative way. So a lot of great ideas. After those conversations, the advocates felt a lot more effective and energized, because it was a major shift in how we regularly did business. Victims were safer with more access to support and resources. And you can get on our website at acesdv.org and find this creative outreach toolkit that we put together as a result of these conversations. One of the major things that was coming through on the helpline was that it was hard enough to get into a shelter before the pandemic, but a lot of the shelters had to decrease their capacity by 50% to follow social distancing guidelines. So there was half of the shelter beds available around the state. So that meant that we really had to ramp up other supportive services like community-based advocacy and mobile advocacy, where somebody could actually go right to the victim or survivor, meet them in a park or someplace safe. January 1st of this year, the new order of protection process went into place, and it was the best timing in the world. So instead of going into court to get an order of protection, now people can get an order of protection, file for an order of protection online at azpoint.gov, which stands for Arizona Protective Order Initiation Notification Tool. The reason this went into place, and it was like a 5-year process, we found that the orders that were being issued through the court, only about 50% of them were being served. So this was meant to streamline the process, make sure more orders of protection were served in a more timely manner, and make it more convenient for survivors, especially if they had an injury, that they could file order of protection online. Now, certainly this has set up its own set of challenges for people that don't have access to the internet or a laptop, but that's where our mobile advocates and other folks come in. And the way that system works is that, you know, the victim would get on this website and fill out a petition. Once it's completed, they would send it to the issuing court in their area. They'd be given a case number. The court would issue the order of protection. Then that court would send the packet to the servicing agency, whether that's the sheriff's office, local law enforcement, constables, whoever is identified in that area as the service agency. Then they will attempt service once, and they've got a quick turnaround time within 2 weeks to get that served. Once it's served, or if they can't serve it, they'll enter that service information into the order protection system, and then that packet will get sent back to the administrative offices of the court to be submitted to the National Crime Information Center. So that made it a lot easier for many survivors to be able to get orders of protection. So they can update it and edit it because they might need to look up a phone number, for instance, or an address. And they can save it at any point they're filling it out. And once they save it, that 90 days starts over again because they have 90 days to complete it and get it sent to the court. They'll appear in court virtually. Clerk will pull up the petition from the case number that's issued, and then the judge grants the order and it's transmitted to law enforcement. So that system was just very timely for the impact of the pandemic. I want to make sure you have some resources. Safe DVS Services is the number that people call to find out about shelter needs and shelter availability. This is our helpline. So we have the helpline, traditional phone call. We have a chat function. And this is also, so if any of you are working with survivors of domestic or sexual violence, and they have a financial need, we've got a pretty hefty, at this point, Survivor Emergency Relief Fund, and we have helped people with anything from their pet might need a vaccination in order to go into the shelter with the survivor. They might need gas money because they just got a new job and didn't have gas money. We'll help with any number of needs that survivors had. So that's an important resource to keep in mind. And then the National Domestic Violence Hotline number, this is open 24/7. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Their staff knows upwards of 60 languages. They also have a chat function. They have a specific offshoot of the National Domestic Violence Hotline called Strong Heart. It's specifically for Native survivors, staffed by Native advocates. And that's a really good resource to have. And, you know, we hope that, you know, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, it's great to be aware, but the only way that things are going to change is if we take action. So I want y'all to just think about and commit to some kind of action that you can do to decrease domestic and sexual violence in our state. I'm glad you're here. Thank you very much. This is my contact information, and that's what I have for you.
Thank you so much, Doreen. All of that information is definitely appreciated. Next, we have Jenna, and she is with the Family Violence Bureau for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office.
Buddy.
Hi, Jenna.
I will go ahead and try to share my screen and see if this works. All right, is that showing for you guys?
Yep, we
Yeah,
have
we
it.
see it, Jenna.
Perfect. All right, I'll just do a quick introduction for myself, and then if Catherine wants to jump in and introduce herself. My name is Jenna Durango. I'm from the County Attorney's Office. I work in our Family Violence Bureau. So basically that means we handle felony domestic violence, child abuse cases, vulnerable adult abuse cases, things of that nature. I've been an attorney now for about 5 years, and with this division for about the last 18 months. So I've got a lot of learning to do. I came from Arizona State for law school and worked with domestic violence victims there as well, serving with a local hotline. Additionally, then I also serve on the Arizona Women's Lawyers Association Steering Committee. So that's very similar to the Arizona Women's Foundation that we're here helping with today, but we're focused on women in the legal system and advocating for more representation, leadership roles, equality, and things of that nature. Catherine, are you there? Do you want to give a quick introduction for yourself?
Sure, just briefly, I work in the Family Violence Bureau at Maricopa County Attorney's Office with Jenna and several other outstanding prosecutors who fight this battle every day. I have been a practicing attorney for 17 years and with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office for 6 years and in family violence for 5 years. And that's enough about me. Thank you. I'll let Jenna take over.
All right, so when we talk about domestic violence, we're generally talking about some sort of violent or abusive behavior committed by an intimate partner or spouse. And that's definitely what the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence defines it as, and it's usually focused on abusive behavior, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, involving intimate partners. However, in Arizona, domestic violence is a little bit more inclusive than that. We do include family relationships, so it's not just intimate partners and it's not just necessarily violent behavior. It also includes relation by blood, court order, living together as a household, things like that. And so you'll see under our Arizona statute, which is 133601, there's a lot that is included there. And so on that right-hand side, you see that, you know, the typical marriage, residing in the same household, having a child in common, being pregnant by the other person, but then it also includes related by blood, which would include grandparents, siblings, parents, things like that, related by marriage, which could include your in-laws, and then children who reside of somebody that you might have a domestic relationship with. So it's a little bit more inclusive than what we generally think about. And then the crimes obviously include things like murder, manslaughter, aggravated assault, disorderly conduct, those kind of things, but it also includes revenge porn, which is using sexual images of someone in an unlawful manner, stalking, harassment, even just verbal threats, if they're credible threats, Interfering with judicial proceedings is considered a domestic violence offense in Arizona. That means violating an order of protection or an order by a court prohibiting, say, contact or coming into physical relation with somebody else. Preventing use of a phone during an emergency is considered a domestic violence offense. And then child abuse, endangerment, custodial interference, and even cruelty to animals. So the legislator has recognized that a lot of times in domestic violence situations, our furry friends, our pets, also become victims of someone who's dominating, using control and abusive tactics on our pets in our household to gain control over their victims. And so that is also considered a domestic violence offense. We talked about this a little bit with Doreen. Any victim can be of any gender, sexual identity, race, ethnicity, age, religion. The issue with domestic violence is about someone wanting power and control and dominance over somebody else. And so that can occur in any grouping of people. There are more vulnerable groups that we do see that have high rates of violence committed against them. People with disabilities who are either physically or emotionally dependent on their abusers. Trends also show that Native American and LGBTQ communities seem to experience higher rates of violence than the general population, but less than 10 or 5% of them get orders of protection. It's thought that access to support services or community support, not having enough counseling resources or housing resources definitely impact that. There's also groups that are underreporting victims who have either immigration issues or prior issues with law enforcement. Either they have prior criminal history or a prior substance abuse issue, so now they're fearful of interacting with police or government agencies. Additionally, we also see male victims underreporting who seem to struggle with the societal standards or appearing weak or not manly, which is definitely unfortunate. And as I discussed a little bit, given the power and control abusers tend to show in domestic violence relationships, children, vulnerable adults in the household, or pets can be targeted, as well as just the children and other adults in the home who might witness the behavior and the trauma that comes from that. So in the criminal process, what happens with a domestic violence case, it's first investigated by law enforcement, and then the prosecutor has to review for charges. So briefly on that, a lot of what we're looking for is corroboration. Certainly a victim coming out and explaining what happened to him or her is definitely taken, but corroboration is really what helps assist law enforcement and prosecutors in getting charges filed. I should have put this in our resources, but I didn't think to do that. There's a free app called DocuSafe, which I know is out there for survivors and victims, and it helps victims keep track of information that could be helpful to law enforcement, or even in just getting an order of protection. And so some of that is screenshots of harassing or threatening messages, the importance of taking video when things are happening, photographic evidence when there's injuries. We definitely see when there's injuries, the progression of bruising can change. So if law enforcement comes the first day and there's just kind of red marks over time, the next week, those could turn into, purple and blue bruising. And so taking pictures of that and providing that to police is certainly helpful. There also might be evidence for the witnesses who were there who saw part of it, or maybe the abuser or victim spoke to someone immediately after and told them about what happened. Medical records or exams, cell phone records, things like that can all be used as corroboration for what happened. The charges are then filed in the appropriate court. There's both misdemeanor and felony cases that are filed by Maricopa County. So it can either go to the city, a justice court, or in Superior Court for felonies. At that time, a plea might be offered, or I just go straight to having the court or a grand jury approve the charges, showing that there's probable cause for those charges to go forward. There's then pretrial hearings where we meet with the court and go over a possible schedule for trial or when trial might be likely. In between that, there are settlement conferences and plea negotiations for if the defendant or abuser is willing to take responsibility for some of his actions. There, a lot of the times, almost probably 98% of our cases are resolved by plea. And so a plea offer is typically made in almost every case, regardless of the strength of the case, if the defendant is willing to take responsibility and agree to a certain sentence for his or her crime, excuse me. If the plea is not an option, if a defendant affirms his right and his innocence, we'll go ahead and start trial preparations. That can include some pretrial interviews, some further investigating, maybe getting some more information. Case can go to trial, and that can take different lengths depending on the severity of the case or how many witnesses or things that are needed. Then we have sentencing, where if there's a finding of guilt or a plea of guilt, the defendant is then sentenced. Some offenses are probation eligible right off the bat. Some offenses that may involve, say, weapons or things like that might be prison mandatory, or if a defendant has a criminal history, that might be prison mandatory. So it really depends on the crime and the defendant's own personal history. And then at the back end, if we get through the finding of guilt and sentencing, if there's any economic loss to a victim as a result of a domestic violence case, that person is guaranteed restitution. And so we might have discussion on how much economic loss a defendant may be responsible for. So as quickly as I could, that's the kind of criminal process. Part of that, I'm sorry.
Yeah, before you get started, we had a question in the chat, it was a great question, asking what happens if our victims are too scared to go forward. So it's been my experience, and you can address that too, that most of our victims either are too scared to go forward or don't really want to go forward. When they call police, they usually just want to call because they want the violence to stop. And a lot of these perpetrators are nice people when they're not committing the abuse. That's part of the cycle of violence that a lot of us that work in this area are familiar with. So there's a lot of apologizing, a lot of the honeymoon, making up for what they did wrong phase. And that makes them seem like a really nice individual until the abuse happens again. But most of our cases, we still will proceed without the victim's cooperation if necessary. So we want to be the one person that stands up to the perpetrator so that the victim doesn't have to, if she's too scared to do that or he's too scared to do that.
No, that's a great question. In other jurisdictions, I'm sure you've heard the phrase dropping charges. The victim's going to drop a charge against somebody, and that certainly does happen in other jurisdictions in other states. In our office and in Arizona generally, a victim doesn't direct the prosecution. That is left to the prosecutor of either the city court or Maricopa County. So a victim can't choose to drop charges. They definitely have a right to give input on how they feel a case should be resolved and if they don't want to see prosecution. However, the prosecutor is the one who ultimately makes that decision. And so part of that question of, what happens if a victim doesn't want to prosecute, there are still ways that a trial does go forward. So even if a victim doesn't want prosecution, subpoenas will still be issued for all persons involved in a case. And that is a legal order requiring the person served to appear for court, or a warrant could be issued for their arrest. So even though, a victim might not want to be there, legally they might be obligated to be there. Additionally, there's evidence that can be admitted even with a non-cooperating victim, meaning evidence that just comes in because of how it is. Or there might even be legal exceptions that allow even more evidence. There's a whole rule book that we have and we have to follow of what's permitted. There might be some permitted hearsay. You might have heard that term before, but there are avenues that the rules of evidence allow certain evidence to come in, even if a victim is not a fan of us going forward with prosecution.
We're getting some questions in the chat too about, would it be dangerous for a victim to cooperate with us? I think that's the question. And so I think it is in a lot of cases, and that's why we sort of take that out of the equation. We have a lot of defendants calling victims from jail or otherwise intimidating them to try to get them to drop the charges. And when we eliminate that by saying, we control it as the state, we proceed without your cooperation, you can tell them you're required to appear or you could be arrested. It is an order of the court. And unfortunately, we've had to arrest some victims to bring them to court. We don't keep them in jail, but we've had to do that to get them to come to court so the defendant understands that it's the court's order, and they're not going to continue to manipulate the process. Will proceed even if the victims aren't cooperative. In most cases, we expect them not to cooperate with us because it is dangerous for them to do so in a lot of cases. Sorry, Jenna, go ahead.
No, you're okay. So, and part of that process is our victims' rights. And so I did want to address that just very briefly. So under Arizona law, we, as part of our Constitution, have what we call a Victims' Bill of Rights. I think we're the first state in the 1990s to implement the Victims' Bill of Rights. And so this requires victims to be treated with fairness and respect and dignity, to be free from that intimidation or harassment. And so they have also rights to be notified of all court hearings, informed about what's happening at the case, present for these court hearings. And then they have a right to be heard by both the prosecutor and the court if there's going to be a change of plea or possible sentencing, or even a motion to change somebody's release conditions, whether that be having them come out of custody or wanting them to return back to the family home. They all have a right to at least be heard. But ultimately, I think both the prosecutors and the court make it quite clear to the defendant and the victim that the victim doesn't control this. And so that takes some of the burden, like Catherine was saying, off of them and puts it on us, because it's us acting in the interest of safety for both the victim and in a lot of times, especially if it's a first offense, rehabilitation efforts of the defendant. Additionally, for victims who are, cooperative, there's some right to privacy aspects. They don't have to submit to pretrial interviews with defense counsel. They don't, a lot of times, especially in controlling situations, defendants may try to ask for the world and try to, dirty up victims' history or, intrude unnecessarily into their background. And so the right to privacy, the right to refuse certain discovery requests are there to protect the victim's, interests and respect her dignity, his or her dignity. I described the right to restitution, which is getting, payment for economic loss that occurred, and then, a right to speedy trial. While a defendant has a right to a speedy trial, so does a victim. And so we can't just keep unnecessarily delaying the inevitable and holding these abusers and offenders accountable for the harm they committed. And so with all of that, we try to do our best to represent the victims. Like Catherine said, there is sometimes, especially because victims are a lot of times still in love with their offenders or have a family relationship with their offenders. They don't want to see harm come to their offenders, but they just want to feel safe. And so that's a hard place to be in as a victim. And so having the prosecution bear the burden of prosecution, holding the offender accountable, imposing consequences, we do our best to try to represent victims and protect society from people who take advantage. Were there any other questions, Catherine, that you noticed on this before I move topics?
Maybe we can address them at the end, if that's okay.
Okay, I just didn't know if you noticed anything glaring, so. All right, some of the other options, so even if a case doesn't go a direction criminally, either there's not enough corroboration or it doesn't get submitted to the prosecution agency for some reason, there are ways to protect yourself as a domestic violence victim, which was touched on by Doreen with the orders of protection. It protects yourself and other family members. You do have to have a domestic violence relationship for these kind of orders. There's another type of order against harassment, but for these type of orders, and to have assistance in getting these served, you have to have a domestic violence relationship. And you have to provide the appropriate grounds, which is some sort of credible threat of harm to you or your loved ones to have this order issued. It does prohibit a person from contacting the protected persons or going to protected places, which could include your home, your workspace, or somewhere that you often frequent or volunteer at on a regular basis. It may require the other party, the offender, to provide their firearms to police for safekeeping. However, it does not resolve any type of landlord or tenant issues or change child custody orders, which is important to know. And so if there are children in common, those do have to be addressed through the family court ultimately, but a protective order could still be sought in cases of emergency. Anywhere in Arizona can issue orders of protection. You don't have to necessarily go to a particular one. Superior Court, Justice Court of Municipality, which is the local cities, all can issue orders of protection. If you do have children in common, they will likely refer you to the Superior Court just to make sure that any orders are consistent with any kind of child custody orders, unless there's an emergency requiring the children to also be protected. It does protect the victims for at least 1 year. If there's any kind of violation or continued concern of threat of harm, those can be extended by the court. And the requirement for enforcement is very important. So we do see this issue come up where, especially in the domestic violence cycle, abusers are trying to win back their victims. They're trying to apologize and make everything better. And so allowing contact despite an active order of protection gets things a little complicated when it comes to enforcement. And so it's easier for police and everybody involved that if there's an order of protection, it needs to be enforced and police need to be called if there is going to be any contact.
And I think we already covered this, but Doreen brought it up. I didn't know she would do that, so that's great. We'll just reiterate that victims can go to this online website, and it was perfect timing considering no one knew the pandemic was coming and they've been working on it for years. So there is a link to the website here. Basically what it does is just help the victims prepare all the forms that they need to prepare. It still has to be filed with the court. I think a lot of prosecutors who got training on this initially thought that victims could just submit everything through the system. It has to go to the court though, be filed with the court, and be served on the defendant. And there was a question in the chat, since it's relevant, I'll just bring it up now. Someone asked, what about a victim, what is a victim to do basically between the time that it is, the order of protection is obtained and the time that it's served. So really that is a holding period for the victim. There's not going to be a violation of the court order to not have any contact with her until it actually gets served on the defendant. But any type of harassment can still be a violation of the law. Any type of threats can still be a violation of the law. So a victim should call and report those if you're concerned about your safety. So the order of protection just it's an order, and we all know who work in this field that it is helpful to get a court order, but it doesn't necessarily keep a person who's determined to stalk and harass you away from you. And so it's just one step to take, and then anytime that someone's violating the order of protection, as a victim, it's a good idea to call and report that. It's also a good idea that once a victim obtains that, to not allow any kind of contact, because prosecutors will look at that and juries don't like it that a victim is allowing that contact. So it just is worth mentioning if any of you out there are looking at getting an order of protection and you want it to be enforced by the police and the prosecutors, to try to limit your contacts that you are allowing. So if the phone rings and it is the person who's not supposed to be calling you, let it go to voicemail. You can block that person's phone number also. Don't text back unless you're texting back to say, don't contact me. If there's a third person that the victim is allowed and the court's allowing to have contact, especially when there's children involved, tell the person, go through that person, please don't contact me. And then can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So Doreen touched on how there's been an increase in the phone calls to the hotlines that deal with domestic violence victims during the pandemic, and we are definitely seeing that as well. Unfortunately, we're seeing the homicides in Phoenix go up by 44%. It's the second highest increase behind Chicago. A lot of us in the Domestic Violence Bureau are on call for homicide cases, and it's unfortunately, it seems like every week that I have been on call this whole year, I have had a call out for a homicide, with the exception of last week. That was a call that went to the wrong bureau, that went to the homicide bureau that should have gone to us. And it is, I saw in the chat, it is very sad. It's very troubling. And I think that this isolation of victims is leading to that. The job loss, the stress, the unavailability of resources for victims to go to shelters and to get away. If you don't have a good enough job or you've lost your income from a job, it's hard to leave an offender that way too. And it's really hard to make plans to leave when you have nowhere to go. And here's some other very troubling statistics. Last year, from January to September, Phoenix had 12 homicides related to domestic violence, and the number went up almost 3 times to 35 within the same time period. And that domestic violence number represented almost a quarter of the city's entire homicides. So there are gang homicides and other non-domestic violence homicides, but that's a very troubling number. And here we have a quote from a professor of criminology at ASU and a retired assistant police chief with Phoenix Police Department, who, basically reiterated people are cooped up, they're isolated, and that's going to lead to domestic violence. And then I just found a quick statistic at the very bottom of that other slide. I'm sorry, sorry, Jenna. There's more DV calls to the 911. This is in Phoenix, sometimes as many as 2,000 calls a month. So besides the shelter calls, that's a troubling statistic for us. And within the domestic violence, I don't want to leave out children. I don't have statistics on that, but I think we've all seen in the media during the pandemic that children have been affected too. They're not in school, so they don't have an outlet to report the violence. They don't have teachers or other people that put eyes on them and see that there's something unusual going on with their behavior or that they appear injured. And some of them don't have phones or other resources, except whatever they're using in school to Zoom to get to their virtual classes. So domestic violence also includes child abuse, and the child abuse is also increasing during the pandemic, although it's very underreported. So the types of violence that are occurring seem to be, based on our experience, much more horrific than we usually have, unfortunately. Next slide, sorry. And we just have a slide here about what's going on with court during the pandemic. Obviously, the courts are trying to limit their exposure. They, early on in the pandemic, had to stop doing trials. So a lot of trials got delayed, which means justice delayed for victims as well. And now we have victims calling into court either on this sort of go-to meeting, which is like Zoom, or calling on the phone on what they call a bridge line. And, one thing that we need to consider, obviously, is some of these victims might still be with the perpetrator. So like the whispering phone calls that they're getting at the advocacy centers, we have to be in the court system aware that they might have the abuser in the same room, or they're in one room and abuser is in another room, and they're, basically afraid to talk, afraid to say how they feel. So we do have victim advocates that work with them, and they can relay the information to us beforehand if some of these victims are able to call in and tell us how they feel. And then it's up to us. If they don't want that information relayed, we can be the bad guys and we can say what we think ought to happen in the case. So we take the blame and defendant can be mad at us, and that also protects the victim.
Yeah, I would chime in on that. I've had definitely cases where even when we have cooperating victims, but they're still sharing custody of a child, or they're scared of defendant's family, even if the defendant isn't out, able to hurt them, being able to bear, again, that burden of it's our decision, we're taking this position and taking the heat off the victim, just because of that close family relationship they might have, is just one way we're able to help in those kind of situations.
Okay, go to the next slide. So I have some resources here, and Christy, feel free to send that out and share the resources too. The National DV hotline has already been mentioned, but it's a great hotline. They have a chat feature, so your victims who can't call in can go to this chat feature and just ask questions. And it's not just for victims, it's for family and friends too. So some of you may know people who are affected by domestic violence who maybe come to work every day or frequently with bruises and explanations that don't make sense to you, and you may be seeking out some help for those people. This is a good hotline for you too. If you have loved ones that you know that this is going on and they just do not feel like they're ready to leave the situation, and they need resources, that's a good way to get that for them as well. They cater to Spanish speakers too. I think Doreen talked about how they have 70 different languages available. They also work through the Abused Deaf Women's Advocacy Services to help people who are deaf, who are blind, and hard of hearing. So that may be another resource, that people don't know about. If they can't see, they can't look up on the internet unless they have other ways to do that. The Domestic Violence Hotline. And there's a phone number there that I have for individuals who might be deaf or hard of hearing, where they can do a video chat feature using that number. They can email, and they can also instant message. And then you already heard from Doreen, but I have the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence contact information up there too. They have a lot of great resources, so please check that out too. On the National DV hotline, there are state and local resources. So you might have a friend or family member who is in another state across the country, and you need to know how to help them. That's a good resource for them. They will work on a personalized safety plan. They have advocates available to do that too. They also have references to legal resources. And I have it bolded and underlined here, and Jenna's gonna make sure I don't say anything bad. I just think it's worth reiterating to all of you family members who are out there who are in this situation, who have a loved one that still loves the perpetrator, who is still with the perpetrator despite maybe years of abuse or lots of abuse. I equate it to a parent of a kid that has a drug problem, and you sometimes have reached your, as much as you can possibly handle, and you can't handle anymore. And a lot of these parents or siblings cut off the person who has a drug problem. But I urge you not to do that, because you may be the only source of support for the victim. And a lot of our victims who end up in terrible situations and end up sometimes in homicide situations, they didn't have anywhere else to go. They're isolated as victims of domestic violence, and the family quit supporting them, their friends quit supporting them. I don't think they fully understand that you can't just leave. There's way more to this situation, and the court process is only one aspect, but really we need funding for shelters for women to go to if they need to get away, or men who are victims of domestic violence too. We need shelters that include pets and children. We need shelters that the victims feel safe and comfortable staying in. We need income for women that meets the same income as men, and jobs that can financially support children. We need to provide childcare to these women and men too, so that they can take care of their kids, or they're leaving them with people they don't necessarily want to leave them with either, and are stuck in this cycle of violence. And we just need to generally in our society support and value women and treat them like we treat men, so that women have the self-confidence as well. So it's really a systemic problem. When we talk about systemic racism, there's also systemic mistreatment of women too, that has caused us to be in this domestic violence situation and caused sexual violence too. So there are just many ways that we need to help women. And if you know someone who is in this situation, please don't give up. And you may be the only person that they are able to go to get out of this situation, and you may help save their life one day. That's how important you are. So I don't think I said anything bad, Jenna.
No, you didn't. And I would
Okay.
just, on that note, it's a domestic violence offender, an abuser's goal to isolate their victims and to get complete power and control. And so, definitely family members and friends may get frustrated seeing their loved one, put themselves back in that situation over and over again, but to be there to support them, to help them come to that realization that they don't deserve to be treated that way, that they can make it on their own. That's a hard line for them to find. And so don't let the abuser win. Don't let him isolate, their victims from their friends and family. Be there as much as you can to support them.
And the next slide.
Oh yes, sorry.
Okay, so this is actually from the Maricopa County Attorney's Office website, and it is just a list of the shelters in the area. Obviously, Google is a more in-depth resource. The Sojourner Center that Doreen mentioned is a good one. A New Leaf is another excellent, or New Life Center, I'm sorry, is another excellent resource as well. And I guess one area that I didn't mention, victims need help with legal resources sometimes. They need a lawyer. There are victims' rights attorneys that will help victims in court too. And sometimes they need help with getting out of landlord-tenant agreements, to move from where the offense occurred and where the perpetrator knows how to find them to a different location so they're safe. So attorneys can help with that. Sometimes there are issues with child custody and they need assistance with that. So there's some resources that maybe Christy can send out to if you need those. And I think that's it. And we can just maybe go through some of the questions.
I wanted to add something, if I might. We spend so much time focusing on the victim and what they should do and what they shouldn't do. And we don't focus enough. I mean, you guys do as prosecutors, but the general population doesn't focus enough on the person that's doing the harm and holding them accountable. Because if we don't intervene and give them a reason to change, they're going to move on to the next relationship, and many times do the same thing to their next partner. We vilify victims for trying to keep the family together, make the relationship work, live up to their commitment and their marriage vows. But we really need to turn the focus to the person that is creating the harm and putting the adult and children at risk in those relationships.
And on that note, when we have cases where the person is not going to prison, we require them in every case to go through a domestic violence offender program, and that program lasts 26 weeks. And it is an intensive program. If there's been child abuse, then we have a parent offender treatment program that's comparable to that. And the goal is to teach them about the cycle of violence and how they need to work on their not trying to control and isolate and dominate the victim, and other ways to handle their anger that are more appropriate. So that's not something the victim has to go through. That is focused entirely on the offender and changing his behavior, regardless of whether he stays with that victim or he goes on to other relationships, or she. Sometimes we do have women who are offenders too. So.
No, and like Catherine said, those are mandatory programs for any offense that's a domestic violence offense in Arizona, which is great. And so it really requires them to identify their triggers and their anger issues and their controlling issues and learn healthier ways. And so it is a delicate balance, because there is some room for rehabilitation for those situations. But then we also see those very severe cases where a woman has 28 injuries because her intimate partner hit her with a bat, and she's being pressured by the family to keep the family together. So it's a very hard balance to find.
And Christy, do you want us to kind of continue to go through some of the questions, or I know we're almost out of time, but I feel like we're very passionate about this, so we'll stay on and answer questions as long as you want.
So, would it be okay if I collected the questions that were not answered and I can present them to you all? And if you want to provide answers, I can share those within our newsletter, if that would work for you and Jenna and Doreen.
That would work great for us. Thank you for having us. We appreciate everybody's time here today.
Thank
Sure.
you so
Yes.
very much. Yes, absolutely. And I want to give a special thanks to the Arizona Foundation for Women for connecting us. It's been amazing to have you, Doreen and Jenna and Catherine, all the information and resources, and I'll make sure all this information gets out as well as the recording.
Agree. Ladies, thank you so much on behalf of Arizona Foundation for Women and University of Phoenix. Thank you so much for your time today, pulling this together, bringing awareness to just an incredible need in our communities. And we're appreciative for your time.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.